Second we started. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Coach Support Show, where science meets strategy. And what are we going to talk about this week, Watson?
Hey, John. So this week, I think we're going to think about a podcast episode that caught my attention. And it was an interesting one from a popular podcast series called Freakonomics. And it was talking about, well, let's say worker satisfaction. And we'll delve into the context in a bit. And then afterwards, we'll talk a little bit about shot calling, I think specifically in League, but it might have applications to other games. But yeah, you mentioned it earlier in the week, and I've been thinking about it, and I think there are some interesting lessons we can learn from research in the world of sport, but also there are perhaps a lot of unknowns that could be really interesting to talk about. So yeah, I think those are the two main points to cover today. And of course, anything happening at Nord.
Yeah, well, let's start with this podcast then. So, something you found on Freakonomics. What was the kind of overview of the podcast for people who haven't listened? In the VOD, I will link it below so people can go and check that out as well. Really interesting one. I just listened to it myself today, so worth checking out.
Yeah, it's a good one. So the podcast is the Freakonomics podcast, and it's by Nick Levitt, and I suppose the podcast came after the book. So they produced a book, Steve Levitt and one of his colleagues, and it's as it might sound, it's based on, well, it stems from the field of economics, but it's applied to the book. Definitely captured this very nicely, but it applied to things maybe we don't get to think about so often, or we don't really spend time dwelling on how that works, or like what are the underlying numbers behind it. And in the book, they touch on some interesting things like, yeah, why crime rates might drop based on legal changes 20 years before, and some like yeah, things we just offering another side to problems that we encounter in day-to-day life, and offering alternative explanations based on numbers. And I've been listening to their podcast for many years, however long they've been running, basically. And a recent one popped up about worker satisfaction. So it's the second kind of a series where they're looking at the NFL, so National Football League in America, which people may or may not know is a very prestigious American football league. I think in terms of actually TV ratings, an NFL game will be one of the most watched TV slots of an average year in the States. So it draws a huge amount of eyeballs. And they did a previous episode of Freakonomics looking at the decline in the contract value of a certain position in the NFL. And it was to do with things like players getting drafted and signed to rookie contracts that don't change over time, but also that rookie contract being about 5 years, and the average career in the NFL is about 3 years. So actually, they didn't need to then give a huge bonus after the rookie contract. They just take another rookie and things like that. So looking at interesting angles within team dynamics and performance from that respect. And they did this follow-up one, which was kind of connected. It was based on worker satisfaction and the idea that the NFL is an employer and that players are employees, and they go to a work environment. And it was looking at work done by a guest around a worker satisfaction survey of NFL players. So how satisfied were they with their teams as their employers? And it opened up all sorts of very interesting angles. But just from that standpoint, it got me thinking, like, what support and what resources and what conditions do you think we should be offering employees? And does that track over to competitive environments like the NFL, and in our discussion, presumably like esports and league? So that was like the context. The guest was leading the survey. I think it's now in its second year, but they started maybe 2023 perhaps. And they got a high number of returns on this worker satisfaction survey. I think they got even like half of the players. So there's about 2,200 players in the NFL, and I think half of them in their first year returned responses, and they were able to sort of name and shame a little bit. So they were able to rank the teams in terms of worker satisfaction, and into the second year they were able to look at like changes in satisfaction. And I think some of the things that came out in the podcast were, one that stuck with me was that most teams provide food after training to players. Some teams, one team asks players to pay for the food after training, and some teams don't offer food after training. And the guest on the show was essentially saying, we all know now that diet and nutrition is important for performance. You want your performers, your employees, to be at their best. Making healthy food the easier option over, for example, fast food on the drive home is presumably a good thing. And that sounds obvious. And then you think, well, if that's the case, shouldn't all employers be offering, good food around in the workplace and things like that? But I think within this context, it's so important for performance. It's kind of shocking that it wouldn't be provided after training. And so that was a big thing in the ranking. I think one of the training environments had a rat problem, and so that moved them way down in 1 year, and things like that.
There
So
was a few things in there that you really wouldn't expect, like the rat problem and stuff like that.
yeah, the peeling floors in the gym, and the guest sort of drew the podcast to a close by saying, if employees, if people knew these were the conditions, they might not want to go there. But at the same time, in the NFL, players are drafted and they enter into a situation where they haven't chosen their employer has chosen them, which is slightly unusual. And also how these conditions are not really widely spoken about. So you might join a team and that's when you first learn of things. So it was interesting exercise to have this survey put out there and the results being public. And I think it's into its at least the second year it's published, I think. And it just got me thinking about, in the context of esports, like what are the worker conditions that we might expect, and what would cause a team's rank to go up or down? So over to you for any reflections, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. I loved listening to it. I love the idea of making it in League of Legends, and there are a lot of crucial differences though. So as the discussion continues, I think I'm probably going to end up being very harsh on people in League of Legends, but I will say, for their, in their credit, one of the big things about this whole discussion, and was kind of behind the entire podcast, is that NFL teams are making loads of money. NFL owners are making loads of money off the NFL teams. And so why are they not spending this money protecting their best asset? That's sort of the underlying part of the discussion. That's not true at all in League of Legends. I don't know if this is bursting anyone's bubble, but everyone loses money except players in esports. Organizations lose loads and loads of money. So of course they had less to begin with than NFL owners, but also they lose loads of money. That's why we're in the state that we're in, with a lot of places kind of, tending towards Saudi Arabian money and all those kind of things, or like Chinese money, and same sort of thing with like ESL and that kind of stuff. Because if it just works on this kind of greater fool premise where you buy in big, you spend loads of money, you don't get any value, but then you sell bigger, then eventually it's always going to tend towards whoever's got the deepest pockets. So that is a really, really big difference, because in the LFL and behind all of this entire podcast was like, okay, why would you not do these things? Whereas, of course, in something like League of Legends, I'll talk about that more specifically, although I'm sure it does cover other esports as well. In general, because of the system, other than Counter-Strike, most esports will probably just be a bit behind what we're doing in League, just because they've been professional for less time. So there I will say that's a big one. But from my side, the other main thing that I'm thinking about, which they did cover in the podcast as well, is in LoL, it's not money savings and things like that. For me, it's incompetence. It's not knowing that this might make any difference. And it's not being aware of how much your performance changes based on the environment that you're working in, the people that are working around you, how clean it is, all that kind of stuff. And there are some cliches about esports players that are definitely true on the whole. And so the people who are involved in esports around it as well are also people who are less likely to be used to a clean environment, even at home or anything like that.
Yeah, certainly. I've been trying to find the survey itself, but I might to do some more digging. But you mentioned a few there. I think the categories I'm seeing were treatment of families, nutrition, weight room, strength staff, and training room itself. So a lot based on facilities, as you say. But yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I do somewhat sympathize with the esports team of today. So I mean, providing excellent working conditions is an expense, and as you say, I think we know that players tend to dominate the expenditure. I suppose the question is like how far of a shift could we push for in today's age to sort of maybe find a meeting spot in the middle? So like what could we expect, or what would be maybe the best areas for teams to look at to improve their conditions? And I think we know some teams have a chef on site, and they probably have good food through that system. I think some teams offer like gym membership discounts, if not full gym memberships. I don't know, it might be they have an on-site, and maybe T1, for example, I think they have a gym in their building and things like that. But I think even just other things like logistics, like are players able to get around town? I think the connection to the family and friends is something I don't think I've heard much about in esports, and how would that even look? Because I mean, what's the conversation between org and a person's wider family meant to look? And if families are sort of welcome in their facility, often we've got players moving countries, even moving continents like that. Even would that score very highly in the sort of improving workplace satisfaction? Hard to sort of think about, but yeah, I liked thinking about it in terms of, in some ways, we want to support our employees to be at their best, and we also, our teams want to support our players to be at their best. And yeah, how far do we go with that? I guess is what's mulling over.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the reason that teams in esports and in LoL specifically should pay attention to it is because it's worth the money. Like from my point of view, it's some of the best value spend that you can have in esports. And whether people actually do this and go through this process, you should always be thinking about. I mean, I've even did a little thing. I made an equation that I've been showing to some teams and stuff like that. But the point is, what you are spending, like what's the likelihood of it giving you a performance benefit? How much is that performance benefit? And how long is it going to take to happen? And that gives you your like value per euro, per dollar, depends on whatever currency you're using. And I think for me, putting time and effort into the space that we're in, the environment that we're in, is a massive missed opportunity for most teams. However, the other thing that I'll say here is that people are getting so much better at it so quickly. So when I was in the LEC, whatever it was, 4 or 5 years ago, it was a complete mess. Like the idea of, okay, rats maybe is a bit extreme, but the idea that someone would have a good facility, something that I could go around and describe as a professional environment, any team, I would be shocked if there was one, So we're really not talking about a high bar, but it is getting much better. So since then, every single team has built specific facilities, and okay, they're not as fancy as they sound, and they're not as good when you walk around as they try to make them look on camera and all those kind of things. And even then, I would argue you can make some very easy benefits for being for the places that we've got. But happy to talk about all of this. I think it'd be really good to go through each of those sections. Originally, I wrote down just what I would like to have in a LoL environment, because I love this kind of stuff. I think it's really important, and I think that I can bring that to teams, whether it's my role or not. So it has been the thing that I've done. Solari and Excel, both in Excel, it was originally the gaming house, then the facility in Twickenham and in Berlin that I was involved in trying to optimize, very much trying, not succeeding. And then at Solari as well, creating their first ever one where they were actually bringing players, all that kind of thing. So I'm happy to talk about all of that and share all those stories as well. But maybe we could just go through what an ideal would be, or even just some ideas in each of those areas.
Yeah, certainly. So the broad areas again: treatment of families, nutrition, weight room, strength staff, training room. I wish I could find the individual items, because the items will be slightly different. But
well, we can just do like training room, for example, and then just do it like that.
Great start. So training room. So that's where the PCs will be, right? That'll be where the PCs will be. And okay, let's start there. That's where the team trains. What would you?
Scrim room,
What's
I
what's
think.
what's
Yeah.
current? What's average? Yeah,
Yeah.
scrim room. What's
Yeah.
current, and what would we like?
Well, I think what is current is very much dependent on the place that you have. Almost no one is in custom build anything. So it's not like we can decide what you've got. I think sometimes actually that has led to better situations than if people have been allowed to design design their own rooms. What most teams will opt for is, of course, 5 computers in a row, probably in a row the same as you would get in on stage, and probably um, wanting to be in the same order.
Mhm.
Some teams do. I mean, for example, I wanted to make sure that the desks were the same and they were the same height as in the LEC studio and all that kind of thing. I don't know if that's what teams still do. I think that was just a fun idea. I think the downside that happens is that people took that and made it this big marketing thing. And for me, it was like, guys, it's just a little bit of fun. And it's not like we're optimizing the space to that level in any other way, so we shouldn't be bragging about it.
Mhm.
But that's a separate thing. So 5 players in a row. I personally would have the coaches in another room, but the standard I think is a coach PC in that room as well, 1 or 2 coach PCs for the 2 coaches. Then again, I would have a VOD review room in another room, but the standard is to have it in the same room. So a big screen of some sort, either a TV or a projector that people can swivel their chairs around and look at. So we basically need, each person has to have an individual workstation, which for us is just, of course, a PC and a setup like that. And then we
Mhm.
need an area to do VOD reviews where we all come around and look at the same thing, which depends on your budget, you know. So, for example, in Reading, at the first split when I first arrived, it was just everyone gets up and walks and stands around the coach's PC, and we all gather around looking at one PC-sized monitor. And we
Yeah.
actually had a TV in the other room that we hadn't worked. Like when I arrived, no one had thought about like, can we just like run a long HDMI cable that costs £5 from Tesco or something, and actually just watch it on there,
Put on the big screen.
which we could do, and we did in future splits, and we even moved stuff around to get it closer to the coach's PC so that you could do that and stream it from the
Yeah.
coach's PC and those kind of things. So that's kind of what we've got as standard. I can explain maybe why I would like to do those things slightly differently, or is there any other thoughts that you had already?
Well, one of them stood out to me. I've been to a few elite scrim rooms, training houses, gaming houses. In 2019, I went to Rogue's gaming house because it had a kitchen and a social area connected to where the players trained. They weren't in a row, and I think only one since has been in a row. I saw a few pictures from I think Fnatic put a post up recently, and they're actually 2 on each wall facing opposite, and 1 at the end facing another direction. And then I've been in. I was doing some teaching on a diploma program in Paris in the Stade de France at Team Vitality's training center, should we call it? And their Rocket League team was training, and actually they had probably a classroom kind of setup with like even maybe more than 5, definitely more than 5 PCs, maybe even more than 10. And it was Rocket League team training, and they were dotted around the room, so they weren't even sitting in a row next to each other. But there was also a coach in on one of those PCs. But yeah, the in a row thing makes sense to me in the fact that that's how you will play on stage. Is there what is there an advantage? Like, do you think it's going to be drastically different if you
No, no,
don't train? Okay,
not really. I think
'cause it is
the
a
other
comfort
thing
thing.
you need like a yeah. I mean, I think if you could choose, if you could build one from scratch, I don't see a good argument why you wouldn't all be in the same row
Yeah,
and be in the same
yeah,
order, because the people who are used to hearing loud or quiet because they're the one sitting next to you, all that kind of thing, I guess you could argue, because you're in this weird position because we're still obviously all using Discord to talk to each other.
yeah,
And no matter how fast your internet is, there's a little delay. And so you hear the person next to you and then you hear them in your headset and all those kind of things. So in that sense, you could argue that being in the right row matters, but for me, it's not important. Like I love getting into the weeds with all this stuff and
Yeah.
like really optimizing everything. But I do think we should bear in mind that like that's not going to win you games to be in a row, and you need a over 6 meter long room if you've got 120 desks 5 times. That's quite
Yeah.
a long room. So unless you're again in like a big facility or you're like custom building anything, being in a row is often not particularly feasible. So I think
No.
to be in a better room, not in a row, is better than being in like a long box, for
Yeah.
example.
I could imagine, like, we like to think about, as you've tried to do, we do like to think about recreating the competitive environment in training. I can't imagine being in a row versus dispersed around a room will make a huge difference. In maybe it's very, very marginal in terms of the performance. Something tells me there is something there about just being comfortable operating with someone right next to you who can see your screen, but that's probably just, yeah, that's probably something they zone out anyway, I could imagine. Where do you stand on light? So
Light.
windows and things that we don't have on stage.
This
Natural
is
light, block it all out.
this is a big one for me. I think here, for example, I would say I'm a big proponent of having natural light,
Okay.
which so technically moving further away from what you actually
Yeah.
experience, but absolutely worth it from my point of view. Now, I have while we're at for Excel, we were at Twickenham, which already I think was a decision that I was against from the start, but that's again another sort of separate issue. And we had, in the end, 3 different places around the stadium over the years that I was with the team. The very first one was in boxes. So in the south stand, north stand, I can't remember. One of the stands, several boxes in a row, one very large box and then 2 smaller boxes next to each other, which wasn't quite what they had sold us, unfortunately, in terms of we were told we could take out everything and just have the actual box and then build it however we liked, which wasn't true. So the downside is that each one had a sink in, so suddenly didn't have enough space for desks. And that was loads of light. I don't know if
Okay.
you've ever been to any of the boxes there where it's a completely glass wall on one side looking out into the stadium, obviously, because that's
Yeah.
normally why you're there, so you can see the pitch. And then also massive windows or even a completely glass wall looking out on the other side as well. So that was a huge amount of natural light, which was a problem because it was too much. And
Mhm.
the screens were often very difficult to see because there's so much light coming in both sides. I think there probably could be some stuff done with that, but you would have to be quite careful. I think if it's a sun facing window and all those kind of things, which absolutely would be worth thinking about, because if the sun is streaming over your shoulder onto the screen and you can't see, that's an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
I think blinds would be a useful thing, which we didn't
Yeah.
unfortunately have, where you can turn it on and off. And then later on, we went into one of the kind of entertainment rooms. I've forgotten what the right word is. Hosting rooms. That's not right either,
Mhm.
but I think you know what I mean. And that was a room which was much, much bigger, and we could put these kind of false walls around, so we could customize what it would be. It was, I think it's called even the Martin Johnson room.
Oh, right.
Which was quite an interesting thing. Just as a separate side story, at one point I was at an event and I was talking to Lewis Moody, who was on that team, and I was like, "Yeah, I had to say we've taken over your room and put a load of gamers in there," which was quite a surreal experience of my life. But anyway, that was a lot better for a lot of reasons, but had no natural light at all.
Mm.
So it was like in the sort of more in the bowels of the facility, which I think also was a big problem because,
Mm.
especially over a whole day, just having natural light is so, so important. Natural light early in the morning, all those kind of things, I think were a really, really big deal. And yeah, just helping people have more energy, be more awake, all those kind of things. I think one thing that is worth always considering whenever you're designing one of these spaces, and a good fun test, which a guy that we're working with called Keith Gladstone suggested, is get a plant and put it in the scrim room. If your plant dies, how do you expect people to thrive in this environment?
That's
And I think
so good.
it definitely would have died, even if we'd have tried to set up like a grow light or something. So I think
Yeah,
that's quite an interesting test. So
that's
there, natural
great.
light, I've seen both sides, but for me, I would have as a answer to the question, I would definitely have natural light. I think if
Mhm.
we can control it somehow, sure. If you can be in a situation where the scrim room itself doesn't have any natural light, but you step outside, and like I said, I would do VOD review rooms in another place, and in that other place or in the corridor or in the lobby, there's loads of natural light. For me, that's a massive win.
Mhm. Yeah, fantastic. I would be so curious to see what players say about that one, because the stadium experience, like, well, the on-stage experience, is obviously not one that's typically done with a window full of sunlight coming through it. So, the idea of replicating that versus just the positive improvements in well-being about having some natural light, you know, it would be really interesting to gauge what players generally prefer in that respect. The separate VOD review room is also an interesting one, because you could probably argue that it would be more competition-like to have just the players in one room, and as you say, coaches in another room, and then actually VOD reviewing in that room, so players have to physically relocate, which is like what typically happens on stage. Um, but I suppose it also is maybe, could it detract from that team, coaching and players together, team kind of environment and that relationship building, because it kind of leaves them to it? I don't know. What do you
I
think,
mean,
Noel?
for me, like I said, the being near the competitive environment is a fraction of a percentage of what I'm like evaluating.
Right.
So when we're talking about VOD review in the same room or VOD review in another room, mostly the counter arguments for keeping it in the same room is like it's easier and
Yeah.
it keeps you all together in that same room and that kind of thing. But for me, I think having some movement in your day is very important. And the fact that we're in that situation where we can actually have a little bit of movement every time. I mean, for anyone watching our scrims, and this is quite common now, again, didn't used to be, but is now, we have a like 3 to 5 minute break after every game where I say, get up, go and do stuff. And even Freddie, for example, just walks in circles sometimes. That's so useful. And having a VOD review space that's separate where you walk to it after every scrim, I think is really important. And I think just helps promote like the movement and that kind of thing. And for me, the other thing actually is that I wouldn't. This is another different point, but the downside of you all being on the same PCs and just like turning your chairs around and looking at a big screen, you're just still in that one same space like the whole time, like that one chair the whole time, that one, you're next to the same people all the time. I think that part is, it's just not optimal, basically.
Somewhat wrong. Yeah.
Mm.
I remember, I hope I'm allowed to mention this, but I remember when you were at Solari and I was zooming in to
Mm.
offer some support every now and then. I remember being remote and the players finishing the game, getting up, moving to the sofa, and you were very kind in setting up the mic in the table so that people online, myself, could actually hear the conversation around the review. But I seem to remember there was times where I think players could get a drink on the way, so it was almost like not just a bit of physical activity, there was also a bit of casual chat conversation, a little bit. There was an opportunity to get some water, all these kind of things that
Mm.
if you just immediately transition from game to review, maybe those things add up over time if you have that
Oh,
space.
100%. Like,
Yeah.
if you don't do that, not even over time, like each scrim day, I think would be worse. You wouldn't need to wait a day. You just wait till game 5 to see that it's worse. Um, and we were in the same room because we only had one room. So
Mhm.
we put it to a different area of the room, and we made it so that you couldn't see the screen from. I think they've still got the same setup that I was doing
Great.
from last year. Um,
Very nice sofa, I remember as well.
yeah, that's actually another point. Different thing. I'll get to it in a second. But I would have it fully in another room because I would want to like fully go somewhere else. Like this is the room that we VOD review in. And the other thing that I would do is I would want to, again, this is an ideal world, I would want to keep the scrim room or the scrim space, which again in my version is just Doesn't have to have natural light. It's 5 PCs in a row. Infinite money, I would make it so that you only scrim from there. So if you're playing any games that are just like for fun, you don't do it on those PCs. We actually did have this as an option in the second place we were in Twickenham, where, and again, I was talking about money, but of course, stuff like PCs is generally through collaborations and partners, so that you can actually have multiple different PCs. So it's more a space that becomes an issue. But we did have the space to have scrim rooms, and then we had 10 PCs in a different area that I wanted to be the ones where they played like solo queue with their friends or streaming or anything like that was from there. Again, didn't actually happen, but I think I still stand by that idea. I still think that can work as an idea where your scrim room is just for scrimming. Like it's just that you come in when it starts, you are full serious there. There's no like nothing on the PCs except from all the tournament realm clients. And anytime you want to play like, I don't know, RuneScape to chill out, for example, you do it in another room if you had the space. So I would really keep it like fully separate and have the VOD review space somewhere else. Now, the other thing, like to move us on to the next point that I would do with this VOD review space, which I want to get your opinion on. I did talk to Go to One about this as well, because he at BDS was doing a lot of this, and he talked about big parts of my job were optimizing time and optimizing space. And what we're talking about here and today is the optimizing space aspect of it. He doesn't think it'd be possible, and I might agree, but I would like to try anyway. The VOD review space doesn't have seating or permanent seating at the very least. So when we VOD review, we stand up instead. So we all stand up and gather around a big screen and can talk about the game. So you're getting 20 minutes of standing for every 45 to an hour of sitting throughout your day.
Wow. Oh, I've not heard of that before, and yeah, my first thought was not to a scientific application of it, but actually rather to I saw a cartoon about shortening Zoom calls by everyone assuming a plank position, and as soon as someone drops, that's the end of the meeting. Yeah, why not? Because we want to reduce, where possible, we want to reduce that sedentary time that can occur through extensive hours playing. So you can have that meeting standing, and it would probably mean it doesn't go on for hours and hours, because it's uncomfortable just to stand for so long. So yeah, why not? You'd get in that it would low levels of physical activity, but physical activity nonetheless, and it's not sitting time. So why not? A colleague of mine, sports psychology colleague, always takes meetings with clients walking through the park, and whilst that has other benefits to it, and it's actually walking, it's just the simple act of not sitting down, and all of the things that can come with that. So actually, just by having a bit of physical activity there, a little bit more blood flow perhaps and muscle use than usual, might even have an added benefit than just the accumulative effect of physical activity. I like that idea. That's cool.
For me, it's focus as well. So I do it now. I stand up for every review. As I said 2 weeks ago, I also do a bit of exercise in between everyone. And for the boot camp, I couldn't do those things. And I'm actually not sure which had a bigger impact, but it for sure had a massive impact directly, like instantly again. Doesn't need to take a long time. Now, the thing that I would say, and the reason that we wouldn't do it, or teams don't do it, is because players complain about it, and then you give in, and then you don't do it. But the thing that I would say for anyone who hasn't had a job that requires you to stand, like working in I worked in a pub for a few months, for example, and even something as like that, if you stand for a shift and you're standing for 6 hours, it's just you would be shocked at quite how much, like standing for a 20-minute half-hour review 6 times a day, you would be shocked at how difficult that is. So what I was saying is, that's why I said maybe temporary chairs. It's like the third review we can have chairs at the beginning, or like every other review we'll have chairs for the first bit, and then we'll gradually work them into this thing of standing every time. And once you get used to it, it's fine. Yeah. And people, I think, would actually appreciate it and notice the difference amongst themselves. It depends on the player. But
what I would love to see, though, would be It's a bit like musical chairs. Take away one chair and add a whiteboard and a pen, and then you rotate a scribe, and the scribe has to stand. So let's take some notes or whatever, and that one person has to stand, and we rotate that person every game. Maybe that would be a happy medium.
If you're doing five games a day, like everyone can always, like you'll always get one person each.
Yeah.
So maybe that. I mean, for me, the thing is that you get these comfy sofas that are great, and the organization wants to provide a comfy sofa for your players, which is great, and then everyone's just like dozing off so frequently in VOD reviews when they're not particularly participating in that specific time of the VOD review. It's so difficult. It's very tiring, and like review 4, review 5, it's very easy to just be kind of switched off. And so having that like standing up, and also having in that space, I would have stuff for like you can stretch and stuff like that. You can do anything, just not sit. So you can walk if we have a walking treadmill as well, and you can do all those things. Yeah, exactly. So you can keep yourself distracted from the fact that you're just standing there. But the whole point is like, let's just not sit. Or even if we're sitting, like, let's not get comfy chairs for the VOD review room. And maybe we have a way to have comfy chairs in there in case we want to use it for any other purpose, because you shouldn't have a space, again, when we're short of money, you shouldn't have a space that's just for only VOD reviewing. Like if you ever want to watch a film together or whatever, it seems like having a big screen is a useful idea. Yeah. And maybe we shouldn't stand to do that. No, but I think that's just a really interesting idea. Those are some of the things that you can do with space that don't cost any money, and for me could well be a performance benefit. But like I say, people don't even explore it. So that's the thing, I think, comparing us to the NFL, where they kind of know about these performance benefits and people aren't taking them because they're lazy, and it's great to like call them out. I still think it probably is majority incompetence, just it breaks apart in the chain somewhere or anything like that. Whereas in League of Legends, I think it's also because most teams don't have a person who's responsible for this, because they don't know it's important. They don't know that you should have someone who is responsible for making sure that the environment is doing what we need it to do.
Am I wrong? One of the ones that stood out to me years ago when I really started watching LEC properly, at least the live broadcasts, one of the things that stood out to me was every now and then you'd see a clip of a team taking their review outside. And actually, I think this was probably around 2019 with Rogue, when Ismail Pedraza was there. I saw them taking outside with a whiteboard, and they were outside the LEC studio reviewing in a best of series, and they were all standing up outside. And obviously from a health and well-being standpoint, and actually probably a performance standpoint, as you say, because of concentration, the fresh air, the green space, standing up, maybe even the temperature change for alertness, all struck me as a useful thing. But yeah, I wonder if we draw it back to the point, which is around satisfaction, player satisfaction, I wonder if those things are seen as gimmicks or seen as like, oh, we're on the cutting edge of performance, therefore it's good. I don't know that. I haven't got a sense of that. But
that's a really big one as well. That's the other thing that I was going to say is a big difference between the NFL and us, is that, again, it is changing. For example, Nord are the most extreme on the like high performance end that I've ever seen by miles. And I think that's partly because they're all older players, partly because of the kind of personalities they are, but also because of the time as well. So I don't think it's necessarily like, I do think it is improving. Again, I think this boot camp, we had way more water than energy drink, and the thing when people were going to the shop was always like, get more water, not get more energy drinks, which is normally the classic. And the real thing was like, can we find a place to eat healthily, not can we just get another fast food meal? But I think if you're measuring player satisfaction in esports, you aren't talking about building a high performance environment. I think those are actually different things. So it does depend on which way you want this conversation to go, because I think the idea that you might stand up for VOD reviews, or you might be in a place where you can even get healthy food, might not even be, players might be more satisfied being able to get takeaway budget. So I was sort of working on for my prep at least, working on the idea of like what actually would be a high performance environment, not necessarily what would be a maximum satisfaction for players environment, even though I think in the long term they would like this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's key, isn't it? It's the compromise now, transition towards like what we know is really, really healthy and stuff later. But yeah, I think making, actually, I would sympathize, because if I wanted to, the next level for me in terms of health and well-being might be to again reduce sugar intake, and that's not always a pleasant thing, and it might not be a performance thing in the short term because I'll be sluggish perhaps, and if we find compromise but work towards it, maybe that can be satisfying. But I think it's also just knowing it comes from a place of expertise and knowledge, and that could also be just a sense of, oh, that's satisfying, knowing that part of the resources that are offered in this team are those expertise, so might be willing to try these things. Yeah, okay, so we've got the training environment, obviously high spec PCs and things like that, but ideally we would want a scrim room with the 5 PCs that maybe doesn't have a window there, but it's kind of has a feeling of on stage like. So maybe you have like a big poster of fans.
Yeah, and speakers where you can play crowd noise really loud if you want.
Yeah, all that.
Not that loud crowd noise is a thing that most esports teams have to worry about. I think KC need a loud crowd noise room, but I think GX probably not quite so much. Or SK.
Yeah, true. Yeah, and then so separate room. I think even just having that space would be probably satisfying, knowing that like there is like a proper facility with different rooms with different functions. That's kind of cool. The health orientated review environment, big screen for that kind of stuff. I think making it as convenient as possible to hydrate and to eat is important, just because of the amount of time you spend there. So in the NFL training context, you probably expect a canteen of some kind in the training environment. I would say definitely in the esports training environment, having that on hand would be beneficial over encouraging a player to go outside and grab fast food because it's just there. And I again sympathize with that, because I used to be part of a university that was next to a football stadium, and the football stadium I suspect had within their contract of having that space, they wanted to sell as much on-site food as possible. So I think they restricted what was available in the immediate environment. As a consequence, there was nowhere healthy to eat near this university. And so you tend to go for the fast food options that can afford the rent next to a football stadium. And I could imagine actually we want to make the healthy food as convenient as possible, or healthier options. So let's have that integrated within that esports training environment. How we do that? Do we get a chef in? Do we have a deal with a provider? I don't know. As you say, it could be tricky to see in terms of player satisfaction. What would be preferable?
Yeah. And again, players. For me, I would think the more interesting discussion is about what we could do for high performance rather than player satisfaction, because I think it's much harder to kind of guess. So again, it's a bit different now, but we had a nutritionist come in when we were joining the LEC, and several of the players were completely convinced that there was no performance downside to having, like, your food had zero performance impact, and most thought it had a very small performance impact, even over a long period. So I think for me, I think let's stick to what we think we maybe should do, because it's a more fun conversation than trying to guess what players think we would kind of satisfy players. And I think that's the other part that was very different from the NFL, where they were saying this is such a good thing because people were scared to come to organizations because the organization has like so much power. I think literally my first note, because that was right in the beginning, was like, no league player is scared to complain to their organization. They do it constantly. And I think that's one of our biggest problems, that we just all are just complaining all the time. So that's a bit of a different thing. For me, I completely agree with the idea that any healthy habits, we want to make them the easiest choice. So again, not often much better now than it has been, especially around the food. Now, the food might not be necessarily always the best quality, and a lot of times it's nice rather than the most healthy, because if you don't do anything around it from a performance point of view, the incentive for a chef or a chef company or a catering company is to have people like their food and come back. And the things that make you like the food is like cooking everything in butter and adding cream to the potatoes and all that kind of thing. So there's a real balance, I think, to be struck there. And again, player satisfaction esports players would always be on the taste of the food.
Mm.
Again, I have to say as a caveat now, because it wouldn't be for definitely not Matt and Eric and people like that, but for most players, I think even in the LEC, the players like that would be the first thing to care about, even if
Mhm.
they're aware and even if they're bought into the fact that they need to care about their nutrition. If you change the chef and every meal became nicer but worse for them, mostly people, the satisfaction would go up. So
Yeah.
that I think again is one of those things that we have to find as a
Yeah.
balance. But the other thing I think that's really big for me is that it taking out any stress, I think, is really useful. And even this, like, it doesn't sound like a stressful thing to do, but if you've ever been super, super busy and like planning your meals, that's just so annoying. And it's it's so useful to just be in a situation where like, okay, I just don't need to plan, because I know when scrims are done, I know that this meal is going to be there and it's going to be nice and it's going to be taken care of for me and it's going to be the enough food that I don't need to get anything myself. So all those kind of things, like reducing the decision fatigue or even any of the just like mental stack, I think is useful. So it's
Yeah.
not just healthier food. So what I'm trying to say is that any food being there and being nice is good. And if it can also be healthy, then that's better. But the main thing is just having food there, I think, for me, because it just makes everything like so much easier to kind of sort out. And you also have to balance the fact that these are young people who are in probably a new country that they're not familiar with. And it's not like in the NFL where you move your family somewhere. It's you just go yourself as an 18-year-old and you've never been outside your own country. And now you're in Germany. You don't speak any German and you have to instantly perform. You don't get to be there
Yeah.
for 6 months, gradually getting accustomed to Berlin. You have to just day one or week one, probably, be already playing competitive games.
Yeah.
And so I think doing all this stuff makes it just so much easier. So that's the big thing for food for me, making it just easier.
Yeah. Absolutely. Convenient options. I think that would tie into satisfaction though. Just knowing that it is in some respect catered, like it is being thought about and options are being provided. Maybe that would be good for satisfaction. Yeah, with the comment about Berlin as well, that's an interesting one because the NFL study, obviously they're looking at all the different teams, whatever it is, 30 teams across the states, and most of them are based in different cities. And so actually, I think in the podcast they spoke about how earlier on players would tend to be selecting based on what they knew about the city and the location of the training center to, for example, schools and other aspects of like the city community or the environment immediately around it. So like they'd be looking at transport, you know, property prices, maybe things like that. But actually, I suppose for at least the LEC, right, you're all planted in the middle of Berlin, so those things are. You could imagine it's. I don't know if it's Berlin's obviously a fantastic place to be, but to live and work, it must be.
Yeah. Also, it's for the kind of people who are esports players, it's quite different. So I happen to love Berlin, but for a lot of esports players, it's a really bad city to be based in. And I know a lot of people and a lot of staff who are, it's like a deal breaker. They don't want to work in the LEC anymore because they don't want to be based in Berlin. And I recently did an interview with an LEC organization, and at every single stage where I was talking to the next person along the chain, which was ended up being what 3 or 4 different people, one of the key questions was like, let's be completely sure this job is based in Berlin. How do you feel about Berlin? Like those those kind of things, which is interesting because I mean I love it because it's well I love is a strong word, but I think it's a really cool city to be in, and I think I would love to go back, kind of thing. But there are a
Yeah,
lot of people who want to be in NA rather than EU because it's in LA, and vice versa. There's people who
Right.
really don't want to be in LA. So there are some choices around it, but we don't really have that much. Well, we don't have much say because that's where the league is based.
It
Yeah,
wouldn't be a deciding factor though between going to one team. If you're looking for an LEC offer, it's the same for everyone. By the way,
yeah.
I've got my Berlin bagels ready for you. So, anyway,
Yeah, it is and it's not. The area of Berlin is very different.
Mhm.
Obviously, more than any other city, being that
Right.
the two sides are incredibly different. Um, and there are teams who people would prefer. But that's the other big thing in esports compared to this is that I don't think they said already the thing is like for NFL players, it's almost always like money and then how good the team is. I think that's just even more true in esports. And I think also if you looked at the quality of the facilities, again, not necessarily the feedback, but the quality of the facilities, it almost would be the best is the best and the worst is the worst.
Right.
Well, I mean, I guess I've seen actually some things from behind the scenes of SK that looked quite different, and they also used to perform a lot better. So maybe that that also is
Yeah.
different.
Well,
But that's mostly
yeah.
just because of the money, like we talked about. The team that, spoiler, G2 spends the most money. They also spend more. They also have more money to spend on facilities as well, and they've got someone like Isma who's been doing it for a long time and who does focus on this stuff. Whereas
Right.
other people might be slowly moving into that area and seeing, like gradually working towards those maybe nicer facilities, nicer practice environments, and focusing on this other stuff.
Yeah. That's actually, I think, a really important extension to this resources and facilities point is the expertise and the people. I don't think it was really part of the NFL survey. Strength staff, right? So they talk about what staff are there to work on my physical strength and training. And I think I don't have the items in front of me, but I could imagine that captures just general rapport with those individuals, but also perception of expertise. I think in esports, I mean, shout out to Ewan Buffton at SK, the performance manager there. Ewan's a fantastic guy and really knows his stuff. And I could imagine the level of support he's providing is excellent. But maybe it's just one of those. It's an unexpected thing. You don't know about it prior to walking into that environment because the performance staff don't always get the headlines. It's about players and coaches in terms of performance. That normally captures the fan attention. So you don't necessarily hear about the backroom staff's level of support. And I think my perception as well is a lot of teams, not just LEC, but all different games and different levels, we're still looking for what are the essential staff to have, like on our salary, what is the referral chain we need to have in place for specialists, and so on and so forth. And I think there's a real mix of what's provided in terms of the personnel and staff support. So I don't think I could say what's likely to meet with higher player satisfaction or not. I don't know if you've had any experience about the staff aspect, what players really
Yeah,
want.
yeah. I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily make a difference in terms of choosing where to go, but it
Right.
absolutely makes a massive difference of how well you perform when you're there. Um, yeah, 100%. I think it can have a huge impact. I do think I do think it's something we talk about a decent amount now in esports. I think thanks to people like Ismo and stuff like that.
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of teams who don't really do it very much, if at all. And so that's why they're not talking about it.
Right.
So that's where, like, I think of the amount that happens, we talk about it a lot. Or maybe that's just because I know the people who would talk about it and that kind of thing. I think, yeah, I mean, I think the staff do make a big difference, and the like behind the scenes staff, and I think
Mhm.
there is a lot of stuff, or I say this a lot, but basically, I think so much of the hesitancy around all of this kind of stuff, or so much of everything that happens in esports, is just around like esports PTSD and like trying this stuff before and not feeling any benefit or not enjoying the process of trying it, not buying into it, and therefore it doesn't work. But that means now the next time someone tries it, you get the same perception, you get this negative perception of it because they have tried something very similar before. And that's why I think it's always good to have a few things. If you're a coach and you're coming in and you do want to try something new, make sure the first things you try with them, you're like so sure of. So we talked about boot camps last week. We talked about the fact that if you're going to do all these exercises about like all these different areas, the first ones you start with should be the ones that people should go, okay, this is different. And I know what you mean now. Like, I know that this is important now. So we talked about doing the interviews is such a great way to start, because suddenly people are like, okay, right, like this might actually be something a bit different. And this also might be something that is a bit useful. So I think the same thing comes with all the staff that work behind the scenes, especially the ones who are, I mean, it's true for the people doing the game stuff too, but even more true for the people doing other stuff. So I think, to be honest, I hope it doesn't mind me saying this, but someone like Isma, who's been like one of, if not the most successful one we have in League of Legends, I'd say someone like Lars, obviously been unbelievably successful in other games, but the way at least I see it, as his great value to the team is not the expertise he brings, but the fact that he seems to go everywhere and get players on board with the stuff that we all kind of know should be done. So the benefit is not that he's an exceptional runner and knows about running and all this kind of thing, but he actually can get all the players to go running, whereas no one else can.
Yeah. We actually, at a former organization I was part of, we had a couple of events where we invited guest speakers, and we invited Bernadette Ramaka. So is she with Koi now? Anyway, she's in the LEC, performance coach,
BDS, I think, still.
specialist in sport and exercise psychology. Excellent practitioner, excellent person, and she spoke about this idea of buy-in just being just so critical for a good relationship with players, but also the perceived support, I think, that they feel. So exactly as you say, like if you can get that sense across that what you're pushing for, what you're encouraging, what you're trying to offer support in is worthwhile, players feel that, that's probably going to spike satisfaction tremendously. If and again, simply with this, if we don't understand something that's being forced on us, not wonderful, probably. Interesting as well, though, I can introduce some research on this bit because I'm part of an ongoing study with some colleagues around talent development in academy environments. And the part of the study has been talking to former academy, esports academy team players about their experiences. And these players are, well, at different stages of their careers post academy, but the academy experience was very professional in the sense of, it competed in a high level. It was attached to an elite team. And in speaking to these athletes, it seems to me that there was across the board, generally the resources were offered, but things weren't necessarily coherent from the org side. So the different areas of support were offered. So physical activity or strength and conditioning, fitness, nutrition, but it wasn't woven together in the sort of development plan for that individual player. So I think maybe that's the next step for esports, is to offer the basic fundamentals and the specialist support in those areas, but then making sure it's woven together in such a way that it really aligns with that player's goals and motivation and current present sort of state. And I think that is where you might see things like the English Premier League. We know the teams have individual development plans for each player that is multidisciplinary and comprehensive and long term. And they have the specialists to tick all the boxes, and those specialists talk to each other to make sure it's all robust. And that's probably the next level I could imagine for esports performance. But caveat, budgets, getting all those personnel in. Also, not dismissing the expertise of those doing it at present at the highest levels. There are people having to just juggle different roles.
Yeah, and I think that's been a lot of where the mistakes have come when they have come, which is that as soon as there was this big injection of money, it's like, okay, well, now let's get 20 extra people to come and do all these different extra things and have a S&C coach and a nutritionist and all those kind of stuff, without having someone who can coordinate it, who actually has also the authority to coordinate it. A lot of times it's having people who can have a kind of foot in both worlds of like the game world and the performance aspects world, I think is quite important, because there's a lot of coaches who don't who don't buy into this stuff in the same way that a lot of the performance stuff might. And so there you're already fighting a bit of an uphill battle, and finding people who can actually communicate really with the players, I think, is a really big one. And I think what people do a lot is they have too high expectations when they come in. I know that was a big learning for our first split with like Callum and stuff like that as well, was that it needs to be lower down. I think like you can't just be putting it on them to come and see you when they need to see you as a sports psychologist, or when we're doing a chat, like let them talk about whatever they want in the background and all this. Like, it has to be a bit more like school and a bit less like professional athletes in some cases. And finding that balance, I think, is unfortunately a big skill, that having the right staff, that's the big area. I think it's not necessarily like, okay, this staff, this person who's doing great work here is just more qualified or knows more or is more in touch with the research. It's more just like they can actually transmit their ideas better. And that will also help massively, as you say, with the satisfaction part, because the person who might know everything but not be able to convey it to the player's not going to be satisfied with working with that coach. So
100%.
Yeah.
And therein lies the complexity of it all. It's the environment, the performance environment is so, whatever expertise you bring to the table, it's so dependent on those social relationships and how knowledge and understanding is conveyed and communicated in those environments. It's so complex. So the other one I think we haven't touched on, we've done nutrition, we've done support staff, we've done sort of training, immediate training environment. They also have, weight room, we could say, is training environment as well. Treatment of families was in the NFL survey. I don't know, is there much to say about the...
I would love it to be a thing.
Yeah.
I've pitched to organizations to do a boot camp with, actually talked to Lord about it as well. We could do a boot camp when you can bring your significant other as well. And all those kind of things I think would be fantastic. But that's one where just budget is the big deal breaker. And you're not moving your family to that city, because when we say family in esports, mostly we mean like parents and stuff. So they're of course not moving to Berlin because you've got a new job there. And we're less meaning significant other, just because of different stages of lives compared to NFL players. But I think one thing that is worth doing and worth talking about is putting effort and time into all those, like helping rent a place and all that kind of stuff. I think that is really undervalued, because what a lot of organizations do is they provide accommodation, but if they start working with people for like a long time, they don't then move that on to, okay, now you can move out of the like group house or the flat that we all have, and you can live with your girlfriend, boyfriend, and we'll help you rent somewhere instead, or we'll help you even buy somewhere if you might want to buy somewhere, and all that kind of thing. For example, I talked with a veteran on the podcast, the other podcast, and he was talking about the fact that he's been working a bit as an agent, but also used to work a lot as a head coach. And he's very, he likes to find a topic and get very, very deep into it. So he recently was researching the history of football and what people did, because he was like, it was like all these people who are supposedly football fans. No one ever told me this, but there used to be a really big problem of importing players, especially from Brazil, and then they don't perform well in the Premiership. And we are very familiar with that problem of importing players from Korea in our case, and then they don't perform well in the LEC. And what they did that had the biggest impact is people and agents even ask them simple questions about what their life was like in Brazil, and then try to recreate as much of it as possible in the Premiership or wherever else they came in Europe.
Mm.
And doing that kind of thing is just completely ignored. So that would include family and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And that part, maybe we don't have in esports, but all those other things, like, okay, I go out with my friends once a week and I do this and I go to this thing, or I watch these movies, or all those kind of things, eat this way or do this stuff with my free time. And that
What
kind of
we wouldn't.
aspect, which would massively help with player satisfaction, I think
Yeah.
probably is the closest of all of these, at least, to being at zero still,
Yeah.
where I think it could be a really big positive impact, but I don't think people do it. I don't think we know what people, we don't go above and beyond to know what people need to thrive in their outside of work life and look to recreate that in
Yeah.
Berlin in this case.
It's interesting as well. Like, do we even know that? Anyway, I was just thinking, if one nice thing might be to ask a player if they're coming from a completely different culture, like, what event in your calendar do you celebrate? Could we do it here? Why that might work particularly well in an esports setting is we're always after content. So it could be something else to post about, for example, but it might make them, you might have to pause and think like, well, what do I celebrate at home that would be nice to have some shared team understanding of that, where I'm going? That could be fun. One it made me think of as well is, so back in the early days of my basketball coaching career, I coached low-level stuff, but it was an adult team, women's team, and we were all very motivated. And I noticed after a while that we had a handful of fans that would turn up regularly, and it took me a while to realize I should check in with who these people are. So I asked the players, like, who are these people? Turned out they were all friends, families, boyfriend, girlfriend, for example. And with minimal effort, I managed to get some club memorabilia to give these people so that they could wear it when they're attending our games. And they became super fans. Like, they never missed a game. They always wore the stuff. Away game, home game, it wasn't far to travel. It was a city league. But it was, I think, never did a survey to assess this, but I think the player satisfaction with just seeing that they were part of our broader system was really nice effect. And maybe there's something like that that could be done here with minimal effort. Maybe it's a free ticket to parents and friends and family to come to the stadium, to what do they call it, studio, to watch them play, for example, facilitating that, giving some memorabilia out, that kind of stuff. A care package sent home if someone's coming from far away. Maybe that kind of stuff could be nice. But like you said earlier, it maybe requires someone to be responsible for thinking about it.
Yeah.
And right now, if it's a bare bones operation, who would we expect to step out of their role to do that? It
Yeah.
could be a tough
It,
conversation.
it takes effort and it takes time. It would take money, but I don't think it would take that much. Like, once a split, everyone gets to bring a couple of people
Yeah,
to LEC, and maybe that's your parents, maybe that's your girlfriend, maybe that's two of your mates, and
yeah,
they can come and just be there for a weekend and hang out with you and go out with you
yeah,
after the game and go have dinner and all that kind of thing. I think that's really good. It would cost a bit, of course, to take these people um, to another country and put them in a
yeah,
hotel, but again, it does compared to the budget of the teams, but it doesn't when you hear the amount that people are being paid, like players especially.
yeah,
So it's like, it's hard to say really. People will say, "Oh, we don't have the budget for that." What they really mean is, we don't think it's worth the spend compared to the other things that we might spend money on. But to be honest, I think that's a really big one for me. Is like, people just don't. There's not a person on most teams who is primarily responsible for this. There are people who are like performance staff, but they're often doing 100 things
yeah,
already. They're often doing more than a normal role in a sport organization. And to
yeah,
expect that they're going to be also in charge of the physical space that people are in, or also in charge of how the scrim room is set up or anything like that, like, is a really big problem, because
yeah,
it's not thought of as a role. And the other thing is, I think just maintaining that also should be thought of as a role. And just so, you take someone like Fnatic, for example. They build this really nice looking facility, from what I've heard, and then both in the videos, even, or the people who I know who go there are like, well, yeah, it's like, it was nice in theory at the beginning, but now it's like, it's nowhere near as nice as it was, and it probably is nowhere near as nice as it should be in terms of there's, I don't know, like just plants around, or decorate the room in a nice way rather than in this like someone who's probably not on the team has decided this is the stuff that we put on the wall. We're going to put champions on the wall. At least like talk with the player and work out what they want to have on the wall, or all this
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Or like I've heard, which I quite like, organizations giving budgets to players to decorate like the room in the house that
Mm.
they can decorate. But the downside is that then they just want to, they either don't spend it or they spend it on like, can I spend it on a TV? And then you just, it's
Right.
not really what we meant. So again, you have some issues. But for me, I just think people really undervalue how important it is to have a place that you want to come to work, and a
Nice. Yeah.
place that is like screams like high performance, and actually people care about this and care about the little things. And there's something that it reminded me of, and I should have written down his name. The head of football at Leicester Football Club was on the High Performance podcast, and he was talking about the fact that for me, this is just like screams this old marginal gains kind of idea. I don't think he actually mentioned that, but he said every single season, I want something to change with the facility and something to get better, even if we just get them a slightly better coffee machine than last
Mm.
year. And it's not because you need to have a good coffee machine. And it is, of course, because of player satisfaction, but not even really. It's just to be in an environment that's constantly progressing forward and constantly looking for the next thing, and constantly like, okay, we're going to just get better. We're just going to get better every split. And there's no one, I think, who's doing that at these organizations, because anyone who might be has also got another full-time job worth of other stuff that they need to do. And if you're the only performance coach, it's like, maybe you're this way inclined and you prefer that this is the kind of thing to be thinking about, maybe, but probably not. It's probably you're also supposed to be a bit of a psychologist for everybody, and also you're supposed to be a fitness coach for everybody, and also you're supposed to be a nutritionist for everybody, and also you're supposed to be a sleep coach for everybody, and also you're supposed to be the person who works on like the communication between the players, and
Yeah.
maybe you're also the person who's supposed to develop the coach as well.
Yeah.
And so it's just like who is doing this? And
Yeah.
I genuinely think, I've thought about this before, like a um esports consultancy where you could just go to hire someone to like come to your facility, look around it, and just tell me how to optimize it. Not only would it be a great fun job to be that consultant, it would also be so valuable for teams to just like come in, tell me all these small silly things that I can do, where I can spend basically no money and get better. Like clean the rubbish up is one that would be there a lot. So for example, like at Solari, for example, where I was sorting out the scrim room, and again, that was as the head coach, but only because I care about it and I think it's important.
Hmm.
And I know in myself that it makes me perform better if the room that I'm in is better. And I do think it is true for everyone else too, but because I'm the one who can just decide that this is what I'm doing, I just did it. And the organization was telling the players that it was ready while there was like loads of rubbish around, which because I hadn't cleaned it up yet. And so players were telling me like, why are you not at scrims today? Like you said, you're still working on the scrim room, but they said we can come to it now. And I'm like, there's literally a big bin bag of rubbish in the middle of the floor, and let alone like vacuuming or cleaning. And it's not because it's like a malicious thing in any way. I think they've got like they absolutely love their players and they want them to be in the best environment possible and stuff like that. But it just wasn't something that was considered, that maybe we should clean up the room
Yeah.
and not just have like empty bottles around and like literally rubbish on the middle of the floor and stuff like that. And so
Yeah.
it was got to the point where everyone else thought it was ready, and I was like, we still need at least a week on this, guys. Like it's not. And then of course it doesn't get maintained, because when the split starts and there's loads of other things to do, and it gradually falls
Yeah.
apart and the plants die, and because no one's watering them, and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, it just gradually slips downhill.
Yeah. Just on that bit of a tangent, but do you find, in your experience, if you do it as the head coach, those behaviors catch on? Like, are you seen as a role model, or is it still sort of no one else feels like they need to follow suit because you're doing it?
I think that if I'd have done it more and more specifically, then it really could have. And I think also people who say that they don't care about if the room is messy, for example, maybe I'm wrong, but I think in most cases, if not 99% of cases, it's just they don't know that they do actually care. And maybe they've never worked in a room that's actually nice to be in. And they do actually notice a little bit when the room is tidy but not clean. That's a very big esports one. Where like, and also a male one as well, I'm sure, and definitely been a problem of mine in the past. Like it's tidy, but it's not clean. And then when you start living in a clean house for a while, you're like, actually, it is a big difference. Like it does really matter, guys.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it would matter if I'd have made it a bigger part of everything. But there's just too many things to do
Yeah.
as the head coach. So for me, I would do it as a sort of this guy was the head of football at Leicester, the head of LoL. That's like even the most senior person there. Like also like that as a leadership thing. Like the most senior person there can do the most vacuuming. That's quite a
Oh,
nice
nice.
a nice way to think about it. Coming back to the sweeping the sheds, literally.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, I think it would matter, and people would learn to enjoy being in a nice environment, and then it would be a
Right.
big deal if then the satisfaction would kick in if they went somewhere else and all that thing wasn't
Right.
there. But I think you could also go through at least a year and people not really notice that you're putting in hours to keep the environment nice, and so therefore, why would you as a coach? Because you're going to go to the next team anyway in a year, and so that's where it's all messy, and you can see how we're in this state, I think.
Right. Ah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Because I think coach as a role model is a powerful thing, but also you want to set the tone where that role modeling is inspiring behaviors in others as well. And I think you can see that working in an environment that is clean and getting into the habit of leaving it tidy after you've, I used to work at a summer camp, and the mantra of the camp director was, leave it better than you found it, referring to when you go somewhere, pick up a piece of trash every now and then. And he role modeled that by doing it on his daily walks through activities. If he saw some trash, he'd pick it up. And you could see how that influenced the staff. People wanted to follow suit, and it would be nice to think that could be achieved in an esports environment as well. So anyway, I think we've spent quite a lot of time breaking this down now, and I think it's my takeaways. It's it's all warped a little bit by where the money is in a pro team, because, like you say, with players having such large contracts and skeleton staff around them, it's and orgs not making much money. It's hard to see
Yeah,
where
it's
more
it's
can
the
be done.
orgs thing for me as well. Like again, the difference in this and the NFL is if NFL organizations are making lots of money and not spending it on
Yeah,
the things that players care about, that's weird, and we should
yeah,
absolutely be talking about it. Whereas esports orgs are losing loads of money and giving
yeah.
it to players. So you
More,
know
more, more
so
is
like do more for them as well, I think is a bit strange. So for
yeah,
me, yeah, I think about it as a value spend where getting a worse player but making the environment better for all your players and all your staff could well be a good option.
yeah.
But you need to have
Great.
someone who actually is in charge of it and can make it happen. And it is not a full-time job, but it should be a main component of someone's job. And
Yeah,
that's the part that we really don't have.
yeah. Brilliant. That's interesting how that emerged from this conversation, right? You need to have that lead figure to run those things, to have an awareness of those things. Great. So I think that's it. Maybe we underneath one of the posts we could post a link to an article about it or something, because it is worth reading, or the podcast
Yeah,
listening
I'll
to
share
as well.
that exact podcast episode. It'll be under in YouTube. On the Twitch VOD, I can't. So on the YouTube VOD, if you're watching it now, do listen to their podcast afterwards. Really interesting discussion, and you can compare and contrast with what we've said about it.
Yeah, exactly. Did we interpret it properly? Great. So topic 2 was shot calling.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can explain what we've done and what we're doing, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, either from sport or from more like academic side of things. So,
Yeah. Could you, I mean, first of all, just for my benefit, but also maybe the listeners, could you like just break down the concept? Like, what are we talking about here?
okay. So in the game, and for me, it's important that it's specifically in the game, you all need to be agreeing like what you're doing. You're going to be in situations where there's multiple things to choose to do. You're always in a situation where there's multiple things to choose to do, I should say. And you need to decide on what to do. So it's coming up with the idea, but also conveying the idea to everyone else, getting all on the same page, basically. So for me, like all of communication is about getting on the same page. And so if your team has been together for 3 years, or you're like robots and you all understand exactly what everyone else wants to do, you would actually talk very little, if not at all. And that's kind of the goal of all comms, is to end up in a situation where we're not talking, because people will play the best if they don't have to focus on anything else. And that's partly because they practice like that, but it is also partly just because they're overloading and this like mental stack kind of idea. So, for example, this is a little bit not relevant to the shot calling thing, but very, very, very relevant to the comms thing. There's a champion in League of Legends where the ultimate ability means you suddenly can't see anyone else. You can just see your own vision. And on our team, for example, we've got some very experienced players and a player who's mostly played solo queue in mid lane. And whenever the lights go off, like whenever the ultimate happens where you can't see, if the enemy character jumps, like he can then jump on you, basically. The second he jumps on like one of the experienced players, they'll say, okay, Nocturne's on me. And actually, sometimes they'll even instantly ping where they are, because no one else can see, but you can see where the ping is, and also you can hear. Whereas if Nocturne was going for our mid laner, it was like silent, because he's trying to live. He's trying to he's trying to dodge all the skill shots. He's trying to position perfectly, and he's not thinking about the talking part, because he's used to doing it by himself. So he's like, he might even be mid sentence and then it happens and the sentence stops, because he's focusing on all the other stuff you need to focus on. Whereas some people might be not talking at all, and then the second the Nocturne appears, they're like, Nocturne's on me. And it's just getting used to it, and all those kind of things. So when we say shot calling, we mean the deciding on what to do.
Okay.
So in games like CS or Valorant, you have IGL, or your in-game leader, who is the guy who basically decides on the plans, the guy or girl who is the one who's responsible for doing that. And that's a very specific role. And a lot of teams will have that person. And in almost every single case, they're also not going to be your best player by any stretch. They're much more like the quarterback, organizing everything. I think there's a lot of reasons why that works there and doesn't work so well in League of Legends. But the biggest one would be you have breaks in between all the rounds, and there's no stop point in League of Legends where you can think and decide. And then you would have specific calls and specific approaches for that round, which you can say at the beginning, and then you play the round. Whereas in League of Legends, there's no like stop start. I think the other thing is that, we say in esports there's no ball, but in Counter-Strike and stuff like that, there's much closer to focus points when people are actually about to meet. Whereas in League of Legends, you're almost always on the same screen as other people on the enemy team. Like there's everything that's going on. So that's shot calling, that's communication, that's like the kind of overview. And I guess what we've done in this week, where we've had no competitive games, so we had a bit more time to get a bit deeper into something, is we've moved from a very loose structure where everyone is talking and people suggest an idea, and if you see a different idea, you suggest a different idea. And if one person is very sure of one idea, they might have to say it a bunch of times, and even then people might do their own idea anyway. We've moved from that to, we've just decided that in the mid and late stages of the game, we're going to follow this one person's call. So we made a bit more of a specific shot caller. Now, it's still nowhere near as extreme as an IGL. If you're more familiar with those games and you watch our game, you'll think like, okay, who is the shot caller? But it is like, okay, if Eric, our support player, if he says we're doing something, you can absolutely, we do it now, we do it with like feedback. You can feedback on that idea. You can say like, oh, okay, I can't be there because I need to do this, or I can't clear that wave inside lane, because you can't know everything. But if he insists we're doing this, we do it. And even if you think it's terrible, we do it. And we're all like on the same page just by choice rather than like convincing each other, which is what we kind of had before, which is good if you have the time to. And the great thing about the more relaxed system is you get all the best ideas from anyone, whereas now they might not, and maybe Eric might have the wrong idea. But the big upside is that we actually get to see what happens with the ideas because we do them.
Mm.
So in a lot of cases, doing an idea is better than having a better idea that not everyone does. But especially in practice, if we come afterwards and we say like, okay, these people went to the waves and these people went to the objective, we don't know which is best still, even though we actually played it because we didn't all do something. So one person thinks, okay, if we all just 5 went to this objective, we would get it. And the other person thinks, actually, we needed to push the waves and then we would have controlled the area. And it's like, well, we didn't do either. So we didn't learn which one was better. So the next time we'll just not make the same, we'll just have the same problem, basically. So that's what we've kind of moved to.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, this is fascinating for so many reasons. Partly because team decision making is a real hot topic in sports research, as one might imagine. But these decisions as well, like you're saying that you're by designating this one individual as making the call, and when he insists we do it, that's you're saying getting everyone committed to that idea is a positive. Is it also a speed thing? So,
Yeah,
having
100%.
that's the decision, we go with it. It's quicker than the debate, the dialogue.
And especially because of the kind of way that he wants to play, it is very fast. And there's a lot of calls that he makes that only work if we all just insta do them.
Right.
And that's also the way that the game is tending. And that's one of the reasons why teams in China, for example, are miles better than teams in the LEC, is just the speed at which they do stuff. They just do it way, way faster. And so that's, always going to be a difficult thing when you play up against them.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you have any idea where these decisions, what are they based on? Where do they come from? Like, what helps in making that decision?
Well, analysis of the current state of the game
Mhm.
and pattern recognition, I guess, as well, from
Right.
where we are now, what we have available to us, and then picking the course of action, just like in any either sport or game or anything that you're doing. So it's lots of playing the game, lots of watching the game, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, does he have anything like? Is there anything in the team about like what he expects from the others? So the reason why I'm going down this route is that there is limited research on communication decision making in esports, as we might expect. There has been some where it's this idea of, if we designate someone to have that kind of IGL role, we want to feed them information from the other roles for that person to arrive at a decision. And what's very interesting about decision making in sport, literature around that, is that often our elite players, they make quicker, more accurate decisions, but sometimes it's often based on just intuition. And a more elaborate decision making process that is slower would be the consideration of alternatives, and that might include checking with other people. So a faster process is to have other people constantly feeding updates, information, and then that person can already have that in their head, and then that will make their intuition just that bit more reflective of what might be better for the overall picture. So, I mean, are you aware of like what this player needs to make those decisions? Have you spoken about it as a team? Anything like that?
Yeah. And one of the reasons that we're doing this now, apart from the fact that it tied into very much something else we were looking at, which is the like discipline of our practice. But the other reason that we're doing this now, from my point of view, is that we have a week where we're not playing a competitive game. And so we just decided like, right, this is what we are going to do. And there will be problems with it. We had situations, for example, where someone died collecting a wave in the side lane. And his response was like, well, I knew I was going to die, but you told me to get it. And so it's like, okay, how are we gonna work that out? And it's actually very good that he just followed the call. He kind of did it in a little bit of a funny way because he was, in reality, he's probably just 90% sure he's going to die.
Right.
And then we talk about, okay, unless we bring this feedback idea. So I think that's a good way to describe it. Like the other people, it's not that they can't talk, they absolutely should talk and they kind of need to talk. And they're giving information always, kind of, updating on summoners, lane position of the person you're against, all those kind of things, strength of yourself. For example, the good thing about having a support do it is they often have a kind of overview of the game. A lot of teams supports do it. But the downside is, well, there's two big downsides for me is that firstly, okay, I don't know how to get too technical. The sort of pace of the game or the most important timer of the game is never the support, really. In the early game, it's the jungler, and in the late game, it's normally like the mid laner. The mid laner's tempo is the most important. And the other downside is that because they're the one who doesn't need to be collecting the waves and stuff like that, you can have that as an issue, and that can be something that makes a difference. So people continuously giving him information, and then when he makes a call, people giving feedback on the call, I think is a nice way to describe it. It's not that they're making a different call. They're saying like, okay, based on that, I can't join because this, or, and then that might update. Okay, he was thinking they would have 5 people for it, but now if we can only have 4, maybe we do something different, or something like that. So yeah, we've had those conversations, and we will continue to, and that's why we're sort of just like, okay, just consciously we're picking a direction, and that way we can learn more about that direction as well, and gradually work out how that works. And the other thing is that if you take a bit of the pressure off other people, like are they going to perform better and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of things to be balancing, but choosing a specific direction, I think, is a good one. But you can't really come into a team and just say from the very beginning we're going to do this, because you kill all the, like, it's terrible for a lot of reasons.
Right. Yeah, I was actually thinking the other way around. Like maybe is it too much for that one player to have to make all the decisions? Or do they feel empowered?
That can be, and when you have some teams have someone micromanaging and doing every part of it, and that means if that player has a bad day, that's it. So we lost a series once doing that. Our communication structure had ended up being very reliant on one player, and he could do it a lot, was a support as well. And we were much better when he was doing it. And so in a way, it was the best thing to do. And then we got to the semi-final, and it was partly on stage, partly moving, like playing in Barcelona, like new country, all these kind of things, maybe. And he just couldn't do it at all. So he was just really quiet in the series. And there was nothing to do to make him not quiet. And we had no backup plan. And so everyone was just kind of lost. So yeah, there's big risks to that as well.
Okay, but broadly speaking, it's worked for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, R1 is less micromanaging. We've also got a lot of people with a huge amount of experience, but it's more like when a decision comes, we're just going to follow this one person.
Yeah, and presumably if they're more experienced, they're actually more knowledgeable about what kind of information they need to be providing before a decision will be made. So that information is probably already shaping the decision in a certain direction. So I can imagine it's probably even conveyed in a more useful way as well. How much does it align with you and your preferences as a coach? Like how much have you had to do too? Because there's some stuff in research, in the sports research around, well, it's a bit controversial, but there is a school of thought that we develop these shared mental models around how we want to play in game, and that there is this idea that we can, as coaches, sort of embed and work on that shared mental model. So it's kind of, a situation arises. In these situations, we want to do these kind of things, and we can rehearse and train that to inform our decision making when it comes to it on the field. It's a little bit controversial because there's another school of thought that somewhat is different to that, but essentially that's everyone has shared knowledge of what's going on, and we have a shared mental model about how we want to be playing in those situations when they occur, and we can inform that as a coach and train it a little bit. So when the league is just such a complex game, how much are you shaping the IGL's shot calls?
One of the best things about it is it's allowed us to do things that I wanted to do from the beginning. So in the very
Cool.
first thing, I wanted to talk to them about like what's our philosophy and our approach to the game, and that
Right.
was a discussion that didn't really work. Um, Partly because it's online, partly because it's streamed and all that. I think there's a lot of reasons why, and it's the first time I've really had to have that wanted to have that discussion right at the beginning, and we didn't have enough time to really go deep enough into it. And now we're kind of doing it anyway because okay, now the way we want to play is the way that Eric wants to play, you know. And as it so happens, I love the way he wants to play. I would play, maybe it's on a scale of like fast to controlled. I would probably be slightly closer to the control side. Not, I would be definitely on the far than him. Sorry, I should have said. So I would
Right.
definitely be near the fast end, but he might be like right at the fast end, and
Okay.
I would be like, you know, 3/4 of the way that way rather than
Yeah.
fully that way. Um, but it allows us to talk about the, because he sees it faster, like he wants to play faster than a lot of the other people on the team as well, which is useful because when we tried to talk about it, what kind of team do we want to be, it was quite difficult because it's very difficult to not just say like basically a good team, you know, you don't actually say those words, but it's like we want to correctly evaluate every situation and pick the best option. And I talked to them about having a, you know, a heuristic for the game, like a rough rule of thumb, because if you don't have that, what you're kind of really saying is every single time we're going to evaluate every single thing possible and make the correct
Mm.
decision. And it's like, well, you can't do that. You have to decide like we're going to value speed over like control. We're going to make plays that you have to execute on quickly, or we're not. Or we're going to make plays that rely on us being able to mechanically outplay the people that we're playing against, or we're not going to do that. We're going to evaluate just, you know, all those kind of things. I think those are. It's very useful to have that kind of discussion, and having one person who's kind of primarily responsible for it also will allow us to, you know, when he gets better at it, we get better at it, rather
Hmm.
than when everyone gets better at it in different ways and all that kind of thing. So there's other benefits there as well. For me, it's very similar to how I would like to play,
Yeah.
but maybe I would play. Maybe I'd play a touch more controlled, but maybe when we get to competitive games, that is going to be how it shakes out anyway.
Yeah. Fantastic. It's just fascinating to hear because I'm just glancing down so I get the title right. There was a research paper in rugby, and it's funny you mentioned this at the beginning. The paper is actually titled "Getting on the Same Page: Enhancing Team Performance with Shared Mental Models," and it's case studies from rugby involving the coaches, and their whole approach to it is very similar to what you're saying. So the coach or the coaching staff had a vision for how they wanted to play. In one case study, it was defensively. They described that as their alpha vision. I don't think we'd use this terminology in esports, but they described it as their alpha vision, and then they presented it to what they defined as a leadership group amongst the players to get a back and forth to create a beta vision. And the beta vision was what they wanted to go out there and put into practice within the team. They did it in a way that I don't think it would really work so well in esports, which was they had classroom based introduction first. So they had players sort of sitting away from the playing field and they walked them through what they meant. And then they went out and set up drills to bring it to life. And then they adapted it slightly and they arrived at a version that was everyone bought into essentially. And it was, yeah, just the whole process is as you've described it, really. It was kind of starting with explaining to players what their vision is, having a leadership group that would deeply understand it. And actually, this was interesting in this case study that they, throughout the course of rugby season, they cycled players into a meeting in which they articulated the vision in more detail than was being done in the drills on the field, so that at some point across the season, not everyone at one time point, and it wasn't overloading players every week, but players were getting the deeper insights over the course of the season. But it was yeah, I mean, it seems to be very effective, and I think it helps players make decisions quicker. And in your case, you've got not a leadership group, but you've got the one individual who's making the call, but he's doing that informed by a vision that you've embedded or shared, and you've all come to some agreement about how that has to play out. And we presume that's going to be, I think, a performance improvement because yeah,
Mm,
making a decision as a team of players in the moment is not easy. So
mm.
you've created what sounds like a cool system there.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. I mean, I hope that we continue to learn more about it as we go, and we can continue to like progress with it. But having just unity on what the direction is already a big benefit for me, or from my side, not just for me. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. I think so far it's been very, very good. But anything that would have got us on the same page would have just had a massive improvement instantly, and it will depend on how kind of deep it can go. And yeah, I think it can work really, really well and build that. Build the knowledge of like what does work and what doesn't, because people are actually following it. Also build the trust in seeing these things work and seeing the fact that we're playing better. So already that helped massively, and it snowballs a lot.
Yeah.
And then working out everyone's individual role within it will be kind of what we're doing for the next few days. And hopefully by the time the competitive weekend rolls around next week, not weekend, it's Thursday, Friday next week, we'll be able to show off that we're a much better team than we were even a couple of weeks ago. So for me, it sort of allowed us to tie everything else together, which is why it's very, very exciting. And we'll have to talk about the fact that we can't hopefully do this episode next week, because we're hopefully in a best of 5 because we've won the best of 3 the day before, which would then put us into top 3 already, and we'll hopefully keep that progression going. But it's been really good. I think it's been a massive improvement, and people are starting to buy into it more and more. So I foresee that it helps us more and more as we go forward.
Yeah, it probably also makes reviews slightly easier too, because you have a very clear decision to evaluate.
Yeah, a million times easier. And if it's wrong, it's also a million times easier.
Right.
Wrong or right. So yes, we played better, but even when we make mistakes, we all make the same mistake because we do the thing, and we can say, okay, the thing was wrong to do here, and then we can say, why did we think the thing was right to do, or was it just mis-executed and it was right to do? So I think it's much, much better.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. It'd be really interesting to hear how that unfolds, and how, because it's obviously a bit of added pressure on that one player, but it'll be interesting to see how that develops and how they thrive in that role, how they tolerate the responsibility and get better at making the decisions. You mentioned the player saying, "I told you so." Like it'll be we'd hope over time that those instances decrease, and it'll be interesting to see how that player sort of thrives in that role. That's really interesting. So one for a future podcast, and hopefully the next Friday.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. So I think a lot that we went over. I think a lot that for me, it's just so fascinating to talk about all that environment stuff as well. I think it's such a big area that we could improve in esports, and I think we will eventually, but we're maybe not quite there yet. And I think it was really good to cover.
I would say like no criticism of current practices beyond, we can't know, but no clear criticism of current practices. But it was just a very interesting exercise, I thought, to think about the conditions.
And like we say, most of these might not be possible because money exists and time exists. You don't have infinite time in the day. You don't have infinite money. But it'd be fun if we did, to see what we actually could do.
That's it. This is one big thought experiment. So brilliant.
Okay, well, we'll call it there. So if you only got a fraction of this, the whole VOD will be on YouTube from pretty much now. But if not, thanks for watching. Doing a little bit with the production this time, which I think worked all the time and had audio for both of us. So it's the same as the team. It's progress, not perfection, but we're gradually working on the right direction. So thanks very much for watching, everyone.